Everybody, my name is Alphonse Ndem-Ahola. I'm a graduate student here at University of Alberta. I'm doing a PhD in anthropology, and I'm studying issues, issues that we all are interested in today. And I'm very honored to be standing here to introduce two great speakers for this morning. And we will have our first speaker will be Isabel Altamirano-Jimenez is Zapotec from the Tehuantepec Isthmus, Oaxaca, Mexico. Thank you. And an associate professor of political science at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton. She teaches comparative indigenous politics. Her research interrogates the connection between resource extraction, land, body, and consent, and explores the contemporary mechanism and practice through which indigenous land is accessed. Among her publications, we have Living on the Land, Indigenous Women Understanding of Place, and Indigenous Encounters with Neoliberalism, Place, Women, and the Environment. So I'm very pleased, and I will ask you to join me in welcoming Isabel Altamirano. Thank you very much, Isabel.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we are located in 36 territories, the land of many indigenous peoples that have left their imprints in this land and continue to do so today. Today's session is going to be focusing on racism, the prejudice, and what are we doing to deal with these issues. And I would like to start by saying that in this past year, there has been a lot of discussions, and we all been sort of really attentive to what is happening in the United States. Somehow, Trump has occupied a lot of our political imaginations. And we have been told how this administration has come to epitomize rampant bigotry, misogyny, unlawfulness, and white supremacy. What we don't often say is that this process, what we're witnessing, is not necessarily an issue that is based just on personality. It's not just Trump. I'm interested in what has the conditions that have facilitated for Trump's administrations to have come to occupy that space. In Canada, often when we talk about Trump, somehow we feel that we are different in Canada, that racism doesn't exist here, that white supremacy doesn't exist here, that somehow the United States is this country with all those abuses, and abuse of power and white supremacy can be at the front. However, in Canada, the realities of indigenous communities and racialized communities are increasing in the same way that the visibility of white supremacist groups. I'm just going to give you 3 examples, and there's many more. Recently, here on campus at the University of Alberta, there has been 2 episodes. One around Halloween, and that was the feather pumpkin that was left at the Faculty of Native Studies. A week later, that thing became a sign that read, "It is okay to be white." The same sign that has appeared throughout the United States universities. So that's one example. The other example that I would like you to pay attention to, and probably you have heard, is look at the recent deaths of teenage boys or teenage young fellows in Thunder Bay, Ontario, without the involvement of the police, without a proper investigation, and what is causing these violent deaths. And the other one, which is that I've been really interested in because it's part of my research and so on, is has to do with the murder and missing Indigenous women in Canada, which has, as we all know, have achieved epidemic proportions. How do we make sense of these three distinctive examples? In my view, while the government and universities and other institutions are talking about reconciliation and about moving forward, at the same time, these events continue to happen, or these processes continue to affect Indigenous and racialized communities. In my view, these examples suggest that racism exists in Canada, that these are not just individual acts of discrimination, meaning that the racism and prejudice experienced by Indigenous peoples and racialized people, and especially Indigenous women, is systemic, is invisible in a society that sees itself as a multicultural society that embraces different. Importantly, for Indigenous peoples, when we talk about racism, though, it's not just the fact that they are discriminated against in institutions or in streets, or that they are, watched continuously. Racism is also the manifestation of a broader structure of domination, and that started with colonialism. And we cannot separate racism, prejudice from colonialism. Those things go together. And we need to start having a conversation of these two processes. As a colonial structure that has been maintained through assimilation policies and legislations, a lot has happened that don't affect directly non-Indigenous peoples, and that we are not learned in schools. So this process of discrimination and racism confronting these communities, for the most part, goes unnoticed. For Indigenous women to be today at the center of a national inquiry, it took about 25 years of activism of these families to mobilize in Canada, and the media constantly ignoring them, and the rest of the population as well. So to me, one of the biggest questions about this is that why this invisibility, or how is that this invisibility placed in a broader structure of how we come to understand Canada and talk about Canada? Part of the problem, I think, in this invisibility is that we have naturalized the things the way they are. And when we don't know history, and when we don't know what has been happening in this country, then suddenly that reality would seem that it doesn't exist. So, and just again to give you other examples of how institutions continue to naturalize these power asymmetries. One of the things that the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, particularly the calls for actions, is talking about, is the need to move for all Canadians and institutions to move away from terra nullius. Terra nullius means, in Latin, nobody's land. And that's what Canada has been understood as. This white, vast land where people came to colonize and to stay. But what we seldom ignore is the life that existed here, and what has to happen to that life for others to come and occupy these lands. And what has happened, or what has continued to happen to maintain that relationship and to maintain that sort of like, the privileges of some at the cost of others. So in my view, for Indigenous peoples, this is not just a matter of organizing anti-racist mobilizations. It's also about fighting other systems of oppressions, including colonialism and patriarchy. Racism doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of, as I was mentioning before, part of broader systems of domination. And all of those affects. This conference is about the crisis of neoliberalism. I just invite you to think about what does racism and these other systems of dominations have to do with neoliberalism, particularly in the sense that the ways in which we organize that separate these things prevent us all from having a meaningful discussion on in what ways the economy is playing out with these differences, is playing out with these power hierarchies, and that we are becoming complacent with just because we are participating in this economic system as well. If movements such as Idle No More and struggles against pipelines have taught us in the recent years, is that any kind of struggles like this is necessarily anti-colonial in the sense that we cannot separate extreme extraction, oil, and pollution and so on from other systems of dominations again. Why? Who is being impacted by these extreme economic extractive processes? What bodies are the ones that are confronting this in the most evident way? So when we talk about social housing, when we talk about racialized gender violence, we're talking about all of these components of these systems of oppressions. So when we talk about what indigenous organizations and indigenous communities are doing themselves, I would like to say that something that we're witnessing more recently, the type of indigenous organizing, is that these communities are creating a set of practices, political practices, that I will call, are sort of being oriented towards a more humane kind of practices where other kinds of feelings exist, including love and so on. And what I'm trying to say by this is that in this process, one of the things that indigenous peoples are challenging racism and prejudices is precisely by revitalizing their own indigenous knowledge, by revitalizing their own intellectual, political, and legal traditions, as a way of getting out of this process and understanding that neither race nor binary understanding of gender relations are natural. They have been produced for a purpose. We have obviously continued to reproduce those in our society. So when we talk about these new understandings of indigenous practices and so on, one is that for indigenous peoples, it's not about just resisting racism. Resisting is something that somehow indicates that you are just kind of stopping something. Indigenous peoples today are actually going beyond that resistance and indeed creating their own political projects. Indeed, creating spaces that are outside of the state in trying to develop other understandings of what it means to be human beings today. And how is that those systems of knowledge and those systems of values and meanings that existed before colonialism can still play a role today in combating racism and prejudice. Because as we said, it's not just the perception, how I as an individual am perceived based on my skin color or my accent. It's about what conditions, structural conditions, create this, that create for other indigenous women not to be feeling safe on the streets, for example. And those are the conversations that I would like us to, or invite us to have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Isabel. Thank you very much for this. Our next speaker is Bashir Mohamed. Where is Bashir? Okay, he's over there. Bashir Mohamed recently graduated from the University of Alberta with a degree in political science. And he's a former co-chair of Policing with Black Lives Matter, Edmonton. So please help me welcome Bashir. Thank you.
Is it possible to get the lights?
The light? Okay, the light.
Yeah. Can we dim the lights a little bit?
Yeah.
I just have a power plug.
I think we can do it from here, but I'm not sure.
You guys, can you see the screen okay? No?
Not. Okay. Okay.
All right. So I want to start, before I get into everything, I want to start with this comment.
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah, I'll also read it out. So, okay, can I take that? Yeah. Cool. So what happened? That's weird. Can you hear me in the back when I talk like this? Okay. So last weekend there was a group of.
Camera can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay. So okay. It's like the weird echo. Anyway, so what happened, I can't make it bigger, but I'll just read it out. So what happened last weekend was there was a group of 12 Somali kids who were at a gym, and people thought they stole something from lockers, but they didn't do that. But anyways, they were kicked out of the gym, and police were called on them, and the video kind of blew up. And this was a comment from somebody. They screenshotted somebody's comment talking about the race card. But it's sad people still like to play the race card. This is Canada, people. There are no minorities anymore. And I thought that was very relevant. And like that comment was like very recent. So yeah, my name is Bashir. I'm with BLM Edmonton. Or I used to be co-chair for policing with BLM Edmonton. And a question I usually get is why does your group exist here? And the answer to that is ever since Black people have been here, we face resistance, and the resistance was organized and systemic, and this history has never been reconciled. And I'm going to get a little bit into that. So when people think about, before I do that, I want to mention something about movements. And one comment we get is that BLM is divisive. You guys win people over. But if you look at the history of social movements, it's never been like that. A Gallup poll in 1961 asked Americans if they approve or disapprove of what the Freedom Riders are doing, and 61% disapproved. And when they were asked, do you think sit-ins, freedom buses, and other demonstrations by Negroes will help or hurt the Negroes' chance of being integrated, 57% said it would hurt. And when you think about the rally that was held in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963, where MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech, a majority had unfavorable views of that protest, and 74% said those protests would hurt the Negroes' cause. So now he's idealized, but when you think about the history of MLK, someone who's very popular now, he wasn't popular when he was advocating for social change, and that's something to keep in mind. This is a quote that sticks with me from him, and it's shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So when you think about Black people in Alberta, most people usually think of John Ware. He was born to slavery in the United States. He moved around the States, learned skills on how to become a rancher. He was one of the first to introduce cattle into southern Alberta, and he popularized steer wrestling, which is this. And he established a ranch in Dutchess, Alberta. So yeah, he was a famous cowboy, and he was known to be able to, tame any horse. Here's some photos of him. Here's some photos of his children. And the Canadian government to honor him named a ridge after him, and they called it Nigger John Ridge. And it remained that until 1970, when they thought maybe we should change the name. But before John Ware, there's the story of another man, and his name was Henry Mills, also born to slavery. He moved to modern-day Montana, and he had a few sons. He moved into Alberta as a whiskey trader, and he married into the Blood tribe, where he became an interpreter. This is the path he took into Calgary. This is subject from a book that references him. In 1873, at a later site of Calgary, travel at the time commented that the interpreter was a Negro. I was told that Negroes master the Indian language more quickly and easier than the white man. His son Dave Mills carried on the tradition and became an interpreter. He he continued marrying into the Blood tribe. He had 4 children, and he died in 1918. His son David Jr. Died in 1918 in the same year while serving in the Canadian Army. That's a photo of him. He's a black guy there. That's one of his sons, and that's another one of his sons. So I was pretty surprised looking into this, because I grew up in Edmonton, I did all my schooling here, and I never learned about black history. When you see old photos of Alberta, you don't see black people. So looking at these photos was really eye-opening, because you wondered what they went through and what their experiences were. And when one of the first major waves of black immigration came from Oklahoma in 1910, the resistance was organized against them. This is from the Edmonton Journal. Petitions were circulated opposing black immigration. The argument was that if the colored population becomes proportionally large, then there's a danger that the prejudice similar to the prejudice manifested against themselves in the States will show itself here. In addition, they argued that black people were a danger to white women. And one of the organizations, the Imperial Daughters of the British Empire, they actually still exist. And they didn't put this history on their website, so I sent them an email asking them if they could. And they said that I must be mistaken. I have the wrong organization. So there's that. You can send them an email too. That's their email. Anyways, at bell.net. Anyways, here's one of the magazines that talked about black immigration. And it said, Fireside would like to know what the people think about the Negro Invasion that is now pouring into the Canadian West and farming large settlements contiguous to and among the whites. There could scarcely be anyone who is not aware of the atrocities committed by members of these terrible communities, the only corresponding punishment for which is the lawless lynching. Already it is reported that 3 white women in the Edmonton and Peace River districts have been victims of these outrages, accomplished and peculiarly fiendish about it. When will the end be? In addition, this was a speech given by politicians across Alberta called We Want No Dark Spots in Alberta. And it opens by saying, like the province of British Columbia being called Yellow British Columbia, our own province might be called Black Alberta. And therefore, I think the time has come when immigration should be made a subject to personal control. Then they list different classes of people, and they go to the 3rd class. And here I can refer to Alberta being called Black Alberta. We do not want to have this name attached to us, nor do we want to have the province black in spots. So that was a very popular belief back then, and it was supported by major politicians. And those petitions were circulated on Jasper, on this university campus. So when I continue through the presentation, try to imagine the locations that I'm referencing. In addition, Borden Park, East Edmonton, there used to be a swimming pool there, and black people are actually barred from swimming in that pool. So black citizens in the 1920s organized, and they went to city council, and one of the they're called aldermen back then, but he said, "It is not a question of superiority of race, but there is a line of distinction between the white man and black races that cannot be bridged." He also claimed to have every sympathy with the Negro, but they should be content with the wide sense of citizenship allowed them in Edmonton and not try and force the issue. That last sentence is something we hear pretty often still. So there was those organized petitions, but this went into our halls of power. This guy, J.J. Maloney, he was the head of the KKK in Alberta, and he was located, their office was in Edmonton, actually just off Jasper, right beside the Westin Hotel. And he liked this guy, who was Daniel Knott, who ran for mayor of Edmonton, and he helped him get elected, and he was elected. Actually, his portrait is like 2 steps outside the mayor's office, if you ever want to look at it. Anyways, when he was elected to celebrate, they burned a cross on Connors Hill. A fiery cross flamed on Connors Hill Wednesday evening, so just close to the university. And when he was in office, they sent letters back and forth to each other. Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, gentlemen, the Ku Klux Klan will hold a convention in the city of Edmonton, August 6th to 8th, and as part of the procedures, we'll hold a demonstration at which, among other features of the program, an open-air initiation will be held, during the course of which a fiery cross will be burned. So this happened at Northlands. And letters were sent back and forth, and the mayor replied, yeah, you can do that. Well, he didn't say that, but he pretty much said that, if you want to read the letter. And he closed the letter by saying, hope that is satisfactory to you, I am. Yours truly, Daniel K. Knott, Mayor. No reference of that on his city website, and his portrait is right in front of the mayor's office. And the Klan wasn't nice, in Canada. This was a letter they sent to somebody in Blairmore threatening them, for example. And they had a lot of sway. This is a dinner they held at the Hotel McDonald's. So yeah, now every time I walk by there, I'm it's shiver, But yeah, so this is a more detailed photo of their dinner there. Oh, and this is where their office was. So when I talk about that, it's kind of hard to wonder how this affected the average black person in Edmonton. These are some photos. I went to the Edmonton Public School archives, and I just dug up photos with black kids in them. And yeah, you wonder what was kind of going through their mind growing up in Edmonton while all this stuff was happening. And this photo is one that sticks out to me. It's of the Edmonton Technical School in 1933. And in the front row in the middle, there's a lone black child. Everyone is dressed fairly nice, but he has one button done up, awkward posture. It's a very strange photo. And I wondered what his name was. And back then, they could write a sentence about each classmate. And I think his name is Stanley because what they said about him was Stanley Petherbridge was walking down the street with The Birth of a Nation behind him. The Birth of a Nation, it was a film that talked about the Klan and popularized the resurgence of the KKK. So I talked a lot about really terrible stuff that happened, but there was also a lot of resistance. I'm sure, who's seen this video before? Okay, so I'll play it. So this is Viola Desmond. Actually, I'll just play the video. It's a Heritage Minute. Well, first I feel like a professor that can't, I can't do technology. Yeah.
All I wanted was to see a movie. One down, please.
I can't sell downstairs tickets to you people.
How dare they? I could afford to buy the more expensive ticket. I run my own business. But they refused to take my money. They left me there all night. On what charge? They said I didn't pay the theater tax. But it was really about color.
Sister Desmond, appeal this conviction and your community will stand behind you.
Do you have any idea what this will do to us?
So what are you going to do? Make it right.
Viola Desmond's case inspired Nova Scotia's civil rights movement. She was pardoned 63 years later based on the injustice of her conviction.
So why do I mention that, and what does that have to do with Alberta? Well, we had two, so this was 46, and we have two similar cases. In 1914, oh, so you know this guy, Peter Lougheed. So his grandfather was a senator, and he owned a theater in Calgary called the Grand Theater. And a black Calgarian named Charles Daniels wanted to purchase a ticket, but he was refused entry. This is from the Calgary Herald. Calgary nigger kicks up fuss. Wants to attend theater with white folk, but management says no. 1914. The interesting thing about this case was he actually sued, and he won. Gets damages from Calgary Playhouse. Negro was refused admission to the performance at Sherman Grand Theater. And a similar, this is some quotes, but I'll just jump here. So this also happened in Edmonton too, in 1923. I was going in through the archives and I found this article. It's very small, but Color Women Sued Theater, a case which has excited considerable interest in theoretical circles, was decided before his judge. The case was Miss Lulu Anderson versus the Brown Investment Company Metropolitan Theater, and was decided on the ground that the reservation on the ticket, which said that the management could refuse admission to anyone upon refunding the price of the ticket. So she actually also she didn't win damages. The decision was binding, and no damages were awarded to her. So this happened in 1923 in Edmonton, but this isn't in our textbooks, and it's not in our curriculum. And you have to wonder why. And the obvious answer is it's not innocence, right? There's a very clear reason why this stuff is not talked about. Who knows who this is? No. I'm talking about Violet King, the one on the left. Yeah, so that's Violet King. She graduated from this university in 53, 54, and she was the first black lawyer in Alberta, first black female lawyer in all of Canada. And here's a photo of her being admitted to the bar. Interesting about her, so this is the gateway of the campus newspaper. So when Peter Lougheed was president of the SU, she was a vice president. Can you see her? Well, she's the only black person there. But there she is. Violet King, who is the new vice president of the Students' Union. I was on the SU, I had no idea about this. Funny story, so Pembina Hall, actually where the Faculty of Native Studies is, that used to be a residence. And yeah, Edmonton's weird, so there's a drunken rally of people playing bagpipes and breaking windows, because that happened. Miss Simpson, Dean of Women, said that she heard the bagpipes at 2:35 a.m. and she went down to investigate. She said that she didn't feel that it was too serious, but that she was annoyed by the illegal entry. Reaching Pembina Hall in much diminished numbers, they entered the southeast and northeast doors, where they were met by Vi King. When questioned at the preliminary hearing of any difficulty encountered as she met the boys, she said, "I said, let's get out of here, fellows," and they left. So this is just pretty close to here. And I also think she wrote this article. I don't have time to get into it, but it's really interesting and it's very relevant. In addition, there are black baseball teams in Edmonton, multiple, in fact, and they put out this call out in the Edmonton Journal, and it said they are willing to meet any team which has the courage to play them at most any time and place. They would especially like to meet some of the City League teams, and in fact would not stop at anybody short of the Eskimos. Eskimos were a baseball team back then. Any team desiring games can secure them by phoning 1637. And they had an office on Jasper, too, near the clan. So yeah. It'd be funny when they walked by each other. Anyways, so I dug into the provincial archives a bit more, and I was on some white supremacist forums, just trying to see what they're talking about, and somebody said that the clan was recognized by the province. Turns out they were. They were certified as a society, so Imperial Invisible Empire Association of Alberta, next to the Ku Klux Klan, and then you see the Alberta government logo there. And they had that certification up until 2003. So, and it's not because some bureaucrat was wait a minute, they have to renew their certification every 2 years, and they just stopped renewing in 2001. And they didn't become more progressive. In their bylaws, which were approved by the province, they said to advocate among members of the society the practice of racial and religious integrity. This is a cross burning in Provost in 1990, so this stuff happened well, still happens. And the reason why this is important, Gwen Hook, she says that if more books aren't written about Black history, then that part of history will go into oblivion because the people who lived it are dying. They didn't write things down. They were too busy building homesteads. The only information we have from that era is oral. They taught us to work and to be independent, and that you have to work together to change conditions and make things better. And that influences what we do in BLM. One thing is carding that I'll just briefly get into. Carding is the arbitrary stopping of somebody that leads to the collection and storage of their personal info. We released stats that show that Black and Indigenous women, Black males and Indigenous women were more likely to be carded, Indigenous women 10 times more likely, Black men 5 times more likely. And that caused a discussion over the summer. Yeah, the police went on the offensive, actually. The police chief even said that he wrote this opinion piece and he said they're based on circumstance, not race. The police union VP said he's never seen a racist incident in 20 years, but then he admitted to not even reading our report. The chief also admitted to not reading our report. Yeah, so he didn't read the report until a month in when I went to the police commission and I asked him if he read the report, and he was embarrassed, so he read the report, which is good. But the NDP is not guilty too. They've heavily screwed up. In 2015, when this was an issue, they said it wasn't a problem. And even now, in meetings I've had with the minister, they've constantly said, stop, it'll take time, we need to consult, we need to, time, it'll take time. And we also had to push them because they kept saying that carding was about community policing, when in reality, it's not used by community liaison officers, it's about surveillance. So they're not guilty either. So I want to close by talking about the myth of time. Well, actually, Martin Luther King will talk about the myth of time. And this is something that I want everyone to take away.
We must honestly admit certain things and get rid of certain myths that have constantly been disseminated all over our nation. One is the myth of time. It is the notion that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice. And there are those who often sincerely say to the Negro and his allies in the white community, why don't you slow up? Stop pushing things so fast. Only time can solve the problem. And if you will just be nice and patient and continue to pray, in 100 or 200 years, the problem will work itself out. Well, that is an answer to that myth. It is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. I'm sorry to say this morning that I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists of our nation, the people on the wrong side, have used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always right to do right.
So, so we must help time and realize that time is always ripe to do right. Time is neutral, and that's something I want to take away. And also on that note, if you want to help, there's a petition that Duncan has over there. they'll go to the province, and it's about carting. But yeah, remember that. Time is neutral. Thank you.
Much, Bashir. Thank you, Isabel. This is the time for the questions. I guess you have a lot of questions. Fortunately, we have some time for that, maybe 30 minutes, I think. Am I right? Yeah, I think we have around 30 minutes for the questions. So we have microphone on both sides. So you can raise your hand and we'll give you the floor and you will have the microphone. And we start with you, right? Isabel, would you like to sit here with Bashir? So that... Okay, we start with you.
Okay. Hi there. My question is for Bashir. Yeah, great presentation, as I expected. I'm just kind of curious about if you wouldn't mind sharing, I guess, your kind of whole research process when it comes to searching out all the things that happen within Edmonton and Alberta as a whole with Black history, because you brought up that this stuff isn't really discussed in textbooks in the classroom. So did you find when you're kind of searching archives that like was it particularly hard to find everything? You know, I'm thinking in particular when you're finding the class photos of Black students, and then, like, you know, there's like maybe one or two among a sea of white faces. Like, it strikes me that could be quite buried. So, like, did it feel like a tedious process to kind of try to piece everything together?
Yeah, so like when it comes to researching like the historical stuff, so there's the Peel Prairie Archives, which is actually through the U of A, and it's like a bunch of newspapers in Alberta. The only problem is you can search only one word. So I just like searched all the bad words and try to see what would come up. Anytime I would see reference to something, I would go to those dates in the newspaper and I just like read through all of them and see if I could find anything. When it comes to the We Won't Know Dark Spots in Alberta, I found the title of that speech referenced like a whole bunch of places, but I had to go to the provincial archives, go through, I think, an entire year of the Edmonton Journal to actually find that specific article. So a lot of it's just going into a rabbit hole, and a lot of it, like, it is a little bit hard to get to. Some of it's online, but a whole bunch of it is not scanned and it's not searchable. So if you want to do that, you can just go to the provincial archives. There's one file I want to get. I just haven't had time, which is kind of ironic, but it's communication between the KKK and the Premier. So if you want to go to the provincial archives, you can look for that, and you can help out by showing that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add that, speaking to your questions, that I'm also doing this research, and I'm having the same problem. One thing that you will notice is that it's very, very few that you see things written about the Black history in Alberta, for instance. So you want to go to the library and you want to find something, you start by keywords and nothing comes up because nothing is there, nothing is available. For instance, I will take just one example. I tried to research on how Black people were traveling from US to Canada. And I find something that wasn't even here in our library. It's called the Green Book. I don't know if you know about that. The Green Book, it's written by a Black man in US, and his name was Victor Hugo Green. He wrote that book. His intention was to help Black people travel from New York to Nova Scotia and avoid being lynched on the way. So he will say, if you travel, stop at this hotel. Don't stop at this place. If you stop here, it's dangerous for you as a Black man. So he was listing places like that. You stop here, and if you stop here in the evening, please be careful. You might not want to sleep here. Instead, go and sleep overnight at that other hotel. So it's a whole list of places where you can stop, where you can't stop, where it's safe, where it's not safe. And it's now I have the link. The good thing is that when you ask to the university, they will do everything that they can do and make it available. So I have the link now, but before it wasn't. I even discussed about that with the BBC, because most of them they were not aware of that book. So just to add to that, yeah. Okay, I saw some here. Yeah, I think it was you. Yes, there. And then it will be you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Fred Judson. I used to work at this place. And I'd like to link the notion of myth with some of the things that Isabel was speaking about. And one of the very comfortable and successful myths that one finds right here on campus as an instructor or as a student is that the forces of order are neutral. And by that I mean the Edmonton Police Service, okay? So if you stand in the classroom and you tell students that there's any mistreatment of people on the basis of their gender, their race, Aboriginal woman, or anything like that, you're sort of laughed out, or you're called some kind of subversive person. I'm sure both of you have had experiences like that, and I'd like to hear your reflections.
Okay. Please, Isabel.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Fred, for that question. Yes. I think as instructors, when we are in the classroom, most of the time we need to be emotionally prepared to deal with extremely diverse classrooms, and where the majority is going to be white students. And if that happens, those things have happened to you, Fred, being a white man, can you imagine what can happen to other racialized bodies teaching? So I'm just going to share with you one little part of my first evaluations when I started teaching. I was teaching a class on Canadian politics, and I made the explicit decision that I wouldn't start teaching Canadian politics starting with government and confederation, but rather that I would start talking about Indigenous history and legal traditions that existed here before, and as to convey the impact of what it meant to build confederation with all these peoples. So, you know, it was a really difficult class because there were a lot of those things that Fred was mentioning. You can see students' body language and how they stop listening to you because you are sort of challenging their ideas of Canada as being a compassionate country. A lot of Canadians that comes to university come sometimes here with the intention of continue to see their perceptions reproduced by us. And when that doesn't happen, there is always some kind of tension. When I finished teaching this class, one of the evaluations that I got was, she doesn't know anything about Canadian politics. All she talks about is Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, social movements, and that's not politics. So that was I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry when I got those kind of comments, right? Because to me it was the very idea of a student saying, oh, what I consider politics is just political parties and, you know, all these white politicians. You know, that tells me that there is something really wrong with our education system. That students can go from kindergarten to university without ever listening to anybody talking about Black history or Indigenous history. That's just something that has always blown me away. And that's, as somebody that comes from a different country with a different understanding of indigeneity, or, you know, that's not to say I'm from Mexico. So the indigenous presence is pretty much alive. That's not to say that the state doesn't co-opt it too. But that's something, that's something that always surprised me in Canada, is that profound systemic ignorance. And I'm not saying, you guys are ignorant individually. There is a system that have made us all ignorant on purpose, so that we don't question things, so that we don't relate to other people. So, just to go back again to one of the examples that I was given, for years, when the media has talked about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, there was always a kind of rhetoric accompanying those stories that allows for people to distance themselves from those stories. Because it's always about those people having a really weird lifestyle. Well, let me tell you something. It's not true. That is not the case. The first time that I came to Canada as a PhD student, once, I used to live in Old Strathcona. I was waiting for the bus, and a truck with a white old man in it stopped, and I thought that I was stopping because he wanted to ask me a question, and he was insisting on me getting into the car, right? I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about the history of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. To me, it was just an innocent question. If it wasn't because of the owner of that gas station where I was waiting for my bus, something would have happened. And that guy, the owner, will see me every morning there taking the bus. And he came down to me and said, promise me something. You will never, ever get into a car with a white man or a stranger. Those people are always preying on brown women. And unfortunately, this story that I'm sharing with you is the stories that I hear from my students as well. So this continues to happen. Again, the question is, why don't we see it? Why don't we know? Why is that it's so difficult to think about Canada as a place where certain bodies are not safe?
So when it comes to that question, so one thing that's often, that I hear often is that in Canada we have smiling racism, and also the myth that our problems are not as bad as the States. And the problem, there's modern and historical implications to that belief. And the modern implication is that because we don't, to go back a little bit, so the racism is not smiling, but it's the denial of racism that's smiling. The second you talk about racism and discrimination, that smile goes away for people, and they get super defensive, like the chief of police or whoever. So the modern implications for that is because we don't think we have problems here, we don't collect the stats. So carding stats are not available. We don't collect many stats to do with crime, for example. A lot of it's up to activists, which, because of that work, for example, in Toronto, it was found that black people without a criminal record are 3 times more likely to be charged for marijuana possession than a white person without a criminal record. But that stuff is not collected because we're not seen to have a problem. So that's the modern implication. The historical implication is we end up forgetting this. Well, I'm going to stop using the word forgetting. I mean, it's intentional why the history is not taught, but youth end up growing up without this knowledge, and it reinforces the modern implications and the modern problems. And that's, troubling, and it's important for us to understand because, as the saying goes, until the lion learns to speak, the tales of hunting will always favor the hunter. And we really have to challenge that belief and that notion.
Okay, thank you, Bashir. Or you? Yes. You have a microphone behind.
Thank you.
After that, you'll have the floor, and then him. Okay. Yeah.
Good morning to both, and I wish to commend you both for having a backbone. That's number one. My question is to you, Bashir, but perhaps it's answered in Isabel's anecdote about the pumpkin with a feather this year. And Bashir, my question to you, please answer just with a yes or a no. You need no elaboration. Is the Ku Klux Klan active today in Edmonton, Calgary, and Alberta?
Not officially. Thank you. They're not certified by the province anymore. Which I don't think that should be a good standard.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Hi, Bashir. Being white, I don't feel much discrimination, but I do whenever I get on my bicycle. And when I see you on your bicycle, I think it's a double whammy against you.
Thank you.
So I grew up on the north side, and I always find it funny because when I biked from the north side to campus, like the further away from campus I got like more hate. But the closer I got, the more progressive it seemed. Like, because I think people on the north side thought like I couldn't afford a car, but then when I got to campus, they were like, yeah, you know, environment.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you, for presentations. At first, I thought my question might be for Isabel, but I think it's clearly applicable to Bashir as well. And I compliment you, Isabel, for your work you're doing on the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I attended last week one of the days of the inquiry that was here in Edmonton. And these were very powerful and emotional narratives and stories. You couldn't help but be gripped by them. But they had certain commonalities as well as differences. And the commonality comes really back. One of them is really the centrality of the RCMP in the process, because when a woman goes missing, there is a reliance upon the RCMP. I mean, as racist as it is, that's the organization you have to go to. And one of the things you learned by just sitting there was in terms of the policy and governance of the RCMP, of poor policies and protocols, policies not being followed, policies being made up. So that clearly in terms of policing, it's dysfunctional when it comes to Indigenous people and murdered and missing women. And that's a very serious, I would say, governance issue, among other things. Now, change not only comes with critique of the past and the present, it comes also with the reimagination of what might be and in terms of alternatives. Now, the RCMP is a many criticized organization, historically and at present. So if you can imagine a different type of RCMP and policing, not in relationship to Indigenous people, but we want to have it for all Canadians, what might that look like? And I think that extends to Bashir in Edmonton, of a police chief that was just completely ignorant and didn't care. I think that's there's a hint there of what might change, but what might you say as well? Thank you.
Can you hear me? I think one of the issues with the RCMP is that historically, the RCMP play a role in colonizing the West. They were sent first. So, you know, and the RCMP was also the force that was there to Indigenous communities to take away Indigenous children to go to residential schools. So you can imagine that with that history, there is not necessarily a relationship of, a trust with the RCMP, and it can never be, because this has been the pattern, and it continues to be. When an Indigenous woman goes missing and the family reports that, usually one of the responses on the part of the RCMP is that you need to wait. Because Indigenous women, one stereotype is that Indigenous people, particularly women, are mobile. They're just wandering around. What people don't think about is that that idea of being a wanderer, that's a bylaw that was created at the beginning of the 19th century and so on, to prevent indigenous peoples from being in city spaces, to create that separation, that racial segregation between reserve and cities and so on. So, it's not possible to just make the RCMP something new for indigenous peoples when this is what's happened, has happened, and continues to happen. So what some people are doing in their communities is organizing themselves and starting the searches themselves because they don't trust the RCMP. And I think that at some point, there must be some kind of model, community model that will need to be worked out for the RCMP to work with communities in a more efficient way, and also to reestablish a different kind of relationship. But there is no way to finish that if the RCMP as an institution of the state doesn't come to understand its own role in the domination of indigenous peoples. Without that, it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult. And there must be, in my mind, some kind of community organizing that should bridge indigenous communities and the RCMP.
So one thing a lot of people, like a mistake people make, is when something happens with police, you expect the mayor to be accountable and the mayor to say something. So for example, when the carding stats came out, I think the mayor only put out one statement, but it's interesting. Look for any city councilor statement or the mayor's statements about carding, and immediately after whatever he says, he'll say, but it's not for me to tell police what to do, it's the police commission. So the way it's set up is like there's a police commission, there's 2 city councilors on it, and then there's like 9 public members that are appointed by city council. They control the police. Like the chief of police the police commission is the boss to the chief of police. So they have a lot of influence. They control the $300 million budget. They control policies related to that. If you want to have fun, go and on the police commission website and look at the police commission members, and you'll notice something. I'll let you guess what that is. But so that's a problem because there's not much accountability there because elected officials won't say anything because there's that barrier with the police commission, and the police commission, to be honest, doesn't really. I think there's only one. Yeah, there's one non-white person on the police commission. So when these issues like carding or whatever are brought up, there's no sense that this is relevant, or there's no sense that like this is real. So that's something we have to change. So so that's just something we have to keep in mind and like pay attention to these commissions, because ultimately those are where the decisions are made when it comes to policing.
Thank you. My name's Dale Cunningham. Self-disclosure, I'm an Edmonton lawyer who's been representing residential school survivors in their claims for abuse since the late 90s. My question is to you, Isabel, although I'd appreciate answers or comments from both, and thank you both for your great presentations. It was mentioned briefly, residential schools. I don't think there'd be any disagreement that they're one of the main examples of racism and prejudice in this country, and the colonization in this country. Isabel, do you have any suggestions or comments about what we can do, and I say we being the non-Indigenous population of this country, to heed the calls to action in some of the calls to action in the TRC report about how we can work towards reconciliation in this country between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples? Thanks.
I feel like that's a huge question, but so Thank you for the question, because I think that in the calls for action, something that is one of the calls is explicitly made to lawyers like you and the justice system in terms of when the calls for actions tell us move away from terra nullius, or what happens with the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Part of it is that how lawyers and the courts, without that knowledge, continue to reproduce notions of terra nullius, right? Like through the court's decisions and so on. And there, my understanding is that at the level of the justice systems, there has been some work in terms of paying attention to why is it people fall through the cracks? Why is that a lot of these people that end up in jail reoffend? There has been some work done in that regard, but I also think that it continues to be extremely problematic. When we talk about the justice system, is the police, is the lawyers, is everywhere that does something through that process. And again, I think that one of the best things that I could suggest is that people need to understand, in what ways the law in Canada has been used politically to justify and continue to justify these court decisions. That's one. But others, what more explicitly working on Indigenous laws, what they are saying is that for non-Indigenous lawyers, it's also important to understand what is, when they are talking about Indigenous laws and Indigenous legal traditions, that's another important aspect that lawyers should also understand. Try to bridge these Indigenous legal systems with Canadian legal systems. Like lawyers such as John Burroughs, who are doing like a really, really great job in terms of trying to, establish these commonalities in terms of how that can happen. But I also think that in terms of, working with lawyers and indigenous peoples or indigenous communities, I think that the other biggest issue is listening. Sometimes that's something that is not the indigenous peoples are not given enough space to talk about their experiences and so on. Why is that a person that has been in jail is always, it's always by definition considered that a person will reoffend? What kind of circumstances and conditions create that? And why is that at the end of the day, there is a, disproportionate representation of Indigenous peoples and Black people in jail? Why? I think that those are the questions that also lawyers need to start asking. It's not like the Indigenous peoples and Black people are all bad. There is something problematic with the justice systems that is locking them out, that they is not proportionally represented. It shouldn't be the case, but why it is, And again, I don't work in the justice systems. I don't necessarily understand all of those processes that somebody goes through from being dealing with the police to ended up in jail. But I think that's some of the questions that we should be asking. What's happening that at this particular time, when we are talking about sort of like a crisis of neoliberalism, the prison system is becoming that important.
And also, I just wanted to chip in and say there is also another question that might be a question for another day, but which is very important because we were also talking about perception, how these people are perceived. But that the government is now changing the curriculum for the school. Do you know that? But what is it being done in that area? I'm not sure. I asked, and I was told that they can't say who is working on that. It's like a secret, so you don't have access necessary to, so you can't go there and ask what is in the curriculum. But this is critical because everything starts at school, with our kids. What are they being taught about black people? Everybody knows that black people history started in the 15th century with slavery. Almost everybody knows that about slavery, but that's almost everything that they know about black people. And it's the same for indigenous communities, exactly the same. They are wanderers, they never do anything, and there are, very, very funny story about that. But nothing is written in the books. And my own concern is that what are we doing in order to let our kids, our children know about each other and be able to then include each other to what they're doing. So this issue of inclusion, it's a very critical issue. And we don't have a lot of time. We only have 3 or 2 minutes, but let's wrap up and I will give you the floor for the last word. Thank you. Maybe Bashir?
Yeah, I'll also close. Yeah. Just one thing to note. So when I did the initial math, when we got the carding data, like black people, like we were 5 times more likely to be carded, but indigenous women were 10 times more likely to be carded. So like that was very sombering moment because like it's not only a black issue. So at that point we reached out to Stolen Sisters, April with Stolen Sisters, along with Rochelle Vanier with the Institute for the Advancement of Aboriginal Women, because we knew like us just doing it by ourselves and only talking about the black aspect, like that's not right. So that's just one of the principles we had moving forward with the carding file. Yeah, I mean, aside from that, just the one notion I want you to take away from today is the myth of time, that if we're not doing things, the other side definitely is. And those things may not be good. They're usually not good. And we need to get to work. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Oh, you're going to.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our guests and Isabel and Bashir for this wonderful presentation.